Hello and welcome to the first debate of the EU referendum season. On the Remain side we have Nick Adams. And on the Leave side we have Luke. I'm going to pose to them a series of questions debating whether Britain should remain or leave the EU. I'll start with Nick. Nick, would Britain's economy be better in the EU?
Oh, easily better. It's a very, very simple concept of foreign investment coming from other EU countries, which we wouldn't necessarily lose if we left the EU, but we would definitely lose our priority in, for example, the trade deals, because, for example, America have said that if we leave the EU, it could take up 10 years to negotiate a new trade deal, which would hit our economy significantly hard, which makes no sense, because there's no need to leave it, because there's nothing really wrong now, apart from a few minor issues which can be reformed.
Right. Luke, any response to that?
Well, you talked about America being a country that won't want to trade with us if we leave the EU. We are the sixth biggest economy in the world, the second biggest in Europe. If they don't want to trade with us, quite frankly, then they're missing out as much as we are. And also, if we do leave the EU, then we can talk about the fishing industry. The fishing industry is controlled by the EU, whereas if we leave it, the waters will be free to fish in, therefore we can get more fishing, we can get a greater yield of profit, and therefore we can become a country that benefits off the fishing industry as much as we do any other industry.
Right. How do you counter that, Nick?
The problem with that is that the EU regulations and laws on the fishing industry are to stop fishermen overfishing the North Sea. I don't think that's a valid point, because if we didn't have any EU laws on it, within maybe 5 or 10 years, the North Sea could be completely fished out, and then we'd have a massive crisis on our hands.
The EU regulations say that Germany and France can actually fish in these waters, so it won't make a difference, except we'll be getting the profit, not them. So we can actually use our trade deals to benefit our country instead of using our waters to benefit other countries.
Right. Contentious. So, next section we'll be doing is immigration. We're going to ask Luke first. So Luke, can we control immigration in the EU?
I think we shouldn't, because if we leave the EU, we can control our numbers, whereas if we don't, the EU migrants can come in, but they don't have to go through a test or anything like that. If we left the EU, we could adopt an Australian-style point system, which will allow us to control who we let in, how many we let in, because at the moment, we're getting 330,000 immigrants in per annum, and 180,000 of which come from the EU. So in 10 years, that's an increase in 3.3 million immigrants into the country. And at the moment, there's a strain on public services and housing as it is, and schools also. So in 10 years, an extra 3.3 million people we've got to cater for. In 20 years or so, we just won't be able to cope. There'll be just too many people.
Right. Nick?
There's a lot of issues with that. Basically, the problem is, it's not the immigrants' fault that there's strain on the NHS and public schools and stuff. That's the Tories' fault for lack of public funding. And also, about the point system you said, you got to look at the morality issues with that, because basically what we'll be doing is the poorer countries which they're coming from, for example Bulgaria and Ukraine and places like that, in like Eastern European countries, they will be wasting their own personal resources on training and teaching their doctors and nurses who come over and help. But instead of having it in their country, they'll be in our country, and then they'll be left with a low-skilled workforce, which won't help their economy grow, which again isn't really fair. So you got to look at the morality issues of that. Also, Norway, they're not in the EU. They trade with the EU, but because they trade with the EU, they have to abide by 3/4 of the EU laws. They can't control their own borders, and they're sort of restricted, and they don't have a say in the European Commission, Parliament or Council. So if we were to send into Norway, we'd be in a bad place.
Yeah. Yeah, that comes at Switzerland. I remember it actually has more economic migrants than Britain, and it's not a member of the EU, but that's just a fact that you can take for yourself. But then equally, they are releasing a lot of reports about increased migration as this year and years to come, so very valid points on immigration. So the next point I have is, Nick, in the EU, can Britain remain a sovereign country?
Right. This is a debatable one. You don't necessarily always need it. It'd be better to work with the other 28 member states rather than to govern ourselves, especially under this Tory government, which is really unreliable and untrustworthy. I personally wouldn't trust George Osborne and David Cameron to come up with some viable human rights and workers' rights.
So the issue here is that in the EU, essentially the governing body isn't elected, the EU Commission. And they're the only sort of body that can propose legislation, but the European Parliament, which is elected, can vote on it and change it. So obviously it's difficult. Obviously some people say it is very democratic, some people say it's not, because obviously you've got decisions from above. So this is the issue here.
All right, okay. So on the point about democracy, you have to take into consideration that our political system is just completely useless in a way, because you only need 2 in 9 people to vote for you to win the general election, which means 7 in 9 people don't want the party in power. There's something undemocratic about that. Also, theoretically the most powerful woman in the country is unelected and we have no control over. That's also undemocratic. Also, our House of Lords can pass legislation and they are all unelected. We should probably reform our own political system before taking it out on the EU, which does have some issues, but we can reform it.
Yeah, the figure is actually the Conservatives won the last election with 25% support from the electorate. So that's what you're saying is very undemocratic. Luke, any response to this?
Well, you're talking about how our country is mainly undemocratic. Well, at least the decisions made by our government have some method of democracy in them, whereas the EU countries, the people who are elected there, they aren't elected by us, they aren't chosen by us, but yet they can still influence us. And personally, I don't think that's fair, because if we've got no say in it, then why should they have to govern us? Because we haven't chosen them. We don't really want them in a way. I understand it in the European Parliament though, how they can have a say, because we have actually voted for some of them. But unlike the people we haven't elected for in the EU, they shouldn't be allowed to influence us.
So you're saying they're not accountable?
Yeah.
So really, we shouldn't be. Your best way would be to leave, not reform.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So another question that is in the news a lot recently: would Britain be safer in the EU? I'll start with Luke.
Personally, I think that the UK would not be safer in the EU, because if we leave the EU, then our position in big sort of organisations, national organisations such as the United Nations, NATO, G8 and G20 will be threatened, because these organisations are planning on reducing the numbers of EU countries that have been found inside their, as part of their organisations. And as we are now, as we are in the European Union, it's got less than 10% of the world population, and our influence is really small. However, if we stay in it, we'll have an extra 5 countries, that's 1 in 33, we'll have even less influence in the big world picture, and we could lose our position or lose our influence in these big international organisations, which would put us at risk from other countries because we're not involved or associated with them.
So a background on security. Some people on the Leave side say the free movement of people means obviously extremists can move between borders and it makes us more under threat. But the Remain side often say that it allows us to transfer documents and things like that. So if we work more closely, we can tackle extremism better. But obviously, it's open to debate. So Nick?
The EU side also said that we need to leave the EU to stop an Orlando-style attack. I completely disagree. I think it's wrong. The EU was created specifically to stop, for example, mass genocide, prevent people doing war crimes, prevent people getting tortured, a more fair way of doing things. That is what it has achieved as well. Also, I think it's completely ridiculous, because we can arrest any we can arrest any EU citizen who has a criminal record if we want to, and the EU arrest warrant has accounted to about 13,500 EU criminals have been arrested in the UK up to 2008. So I think there's no really argument against terrorism.
So you're saying that EU
Yeah.
laws help
Yeah.
us tackle terror?
Yeah.
It's a fair point.
But if you notice that you say it's 13,500 immigrants, from the amount of immigrants that are coming in, 300,000 per year, that's nothing. That's a tiny percentage of how many immigrants that are coming in. So then we've got another 213,000 people coming in that could still pose a threat to our country.
The EUs who've been arrested are criminals. The other 275,000 or whatever aren't. That's the whole point. But we can't just get rid of any criminal who's British. There's no difference. The point is that 13,500 are criminals. They have a criminal record if they've done something, a criminal activity in the UK. So
Right, that was heated. The last sort of big point I want to raise is probably one of the biggest points in this debate for a lot of people, and it's, would Britain's place in the world be compromised if we left the EU? That is probably the biggest one of the biggest questions coming from this debate. So I'll start with Nick this time.
No. Yes, it would. Sorry, it would be massively hit because in the EU, people see us as a big team and see us as a unit of sorts, and we should tackle things together, work as a team. For example, on climate change, there have been massive laws and regulations on changing the environment. So no, I think we would be hit quite hard because at the end of the day we're quite a small country, so we wouldn't necessarily be a big part to play in, for example, big decisions. Whereas if we in the EU with 500 million people, we're basically leaving another 440 million people behind. And who would you prioritise more? 440 million people, 60 million people? That's what you ask yourself.
Yeah, this comes when leaders like Obama are saying, if we want to negotiate separate trade deals, we'll be back of the line. We are part of the EU as the world sees it. However, many are saying we're the sixth biggest economy in the world, and as Luke might say, we can survive on our own.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like I said earlier, we are 10% of the world population, the EU is, so we're much less than that. We have small influence as it is. We have a 1 in 28 influence in the EU alone, let alone in the world. And with Turkey, Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania and Serbia coming in very soon, that's a 1 in 33 say in the EU. So we have very little influence as it is. We can't lose much by leaving the EU, and when we do leave the EU, we'll actually probably have more say because we have more control over our own country, which means we can deal with more countries. And in dealing with more countries, we are associated with more countries and have more say in those countries.
So, you're essentially saying the EU is going to expand, and that's going to happen. So, do we both think that the EU is capable of expanding, in particularly Turkey joining in the next few years?
I don't think Turkey will join because they've got, I don't know what specifically they're called, but you've got to have 35...
Unanimous support.
Yeah. No. What is it? It's like 35 laws passed in your country,
Right.
and they've only got one. So I don't think Turkey got anywhere near joining the EU. I think it's a scaremonger from the Leave.eu side.
Yeah, but a lot of leaders are pushing for Turkey to join the EU. I mean, David Cameron said, "Oh yeah, Turkey aren't going to join the EU until 3000." But then he's saying he's pushing to get Turkey into the EU as soon as possible. So if he's trying to get them into the EU, chances are other leaders will share the same sentiment and push for them to get into the EU.
It has been said by David Cameron in recent years that Turkey has been trying to join the EU since 1987, and it requires unanimous support from each 28 member states. So, some people thinking, obviously it could be a good chance, leaders pushing for it, others think it's quite unlikely. So, I think that wraps it up for today. Thank you very much to Nick. And to Luke for Brexit.